Stalin once pointed him out to Roosevelt with chilling pride. That is our Himmler, Lavrentiy Beria, the man whose black Packard made all of Moscow hold its breath. He signed millions of death warrants without blinking. Yet when he finally faced the execution squad, he offered no resistance. He crawled. He wept and begged until the guards jammed a rag into his mouth to silence him before pulling the trigger. How did the most feared man in the empire engineer his own brutal execution? He was born in 1899 to a poor peasant family in the mountains of Abkhazia. But his true ascent began when the empire started to crumble. By 1938, the Soviet Union was eating itself alive. The Great Terror, orchestrated by Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD, had spiraled out of control. Yezhov, known as the Iron Hedgehog, was a sadistic dwarf, a spiraling alcoholic who murdered indiscriminately. Under his watch, the secret police were arresting factory managers, engineers, and generals simply to fill quotas. The economy was stalling. The army was headless. The terror had become a cancer threatening to kill the host, and Stalin needed a surgeon to cut it out. Stalin, the ultimate pragmatist, realized the slaughter had become inefficient. The state required an auditor, not a butcher. It needed someone to rationalize the killing, turning the purge from a wildfire into a controlled burn. He looked south to Georgia and summoned Lavrentiy Beria. Beria arrived in Moscow in late 1938 with the quiet confidence of a man who has already done his homework. He was different from the frenzied revolutionaries of the past. He was calm, soft-spoken, and intelligent. Unlike the frenzied revolutionaries of the past, he smelled of expensive cologne and paper dust. His first act was a masterclass in political theater. He arrested Yezhov, accusing him of the very excesses that Stalin had ordered. Beria then did the unthinkable. He opened the prison doors. In what became known as the Beria Thaw, thousands of prisoners were released. Cases were reviewed. Officers who had tortured innocent party members were themselves put against the wall. A collective sigh of relief swept through Moscow. People whispered that the madness was over, that socialist legality had been restored. They believed that Beria was their savior. It was a lethal illusion. Beria released these men for a single reason: utility. Innocence was irrelevant. Wasted capital was the crime. He looked at the list of the condemned and saw wasted capital. Why shoot a brilliant aeronautical engineer when you can lock him in a room and make him design bombers for free? Why execute 1,000 strong miners when the state needs gold? This was the terrifying innovation of Lavrentiy Beria. He transformed the NKVD from a simple execution squad into the world's largest economic corporation. Under his guidance, the Gulag archipelago ceased to be just a garbage chute for political enemies. It became the Ministry of Shadow Economics. He streamlined the arrest process. The erratic late-night abductions of the Yezhov era were replaced by bureaucratic precision. Arrests were no longer emotional, they were transactional. If the timber industry in Siberia was falling behind its 5-year plan, Beria would review the demographics. He would order the arrest of 5,000 healthy males from a specific region to fill the labor shortage. The crime didn't matter, the quota did. His famous maxim was whispered in the quarters of the Lubyanka: "Bring me the man, and I will find the crime." He introduced a chilling efficiency to the camps. He calculated the exact number of calories required to keep a prisoner working for 3 months before they died of exhaustion. He determined that it was cheaper to work a man to death and replace him than to feed him enough to survive for a year. He turned human suffering into a line item on a spreadsheet. By 1941, Beria had consolidated his power base completely. He had placed his loyal Georgian lieutenants in every key position of the security apparatus. He had the files on every member of the Politburo. He walked the halls of the Kremlin with a soft tread, his eyes magnifying behind those round lenses, observing everything, forgetting nothing. He had created a state within a state, a kingdom of barbed wire and watchtowers that answered only to him. But as the clouds of war gathered on the western border, Beria was about to be given a task that would require an even greater sacrifice of human life. The German tanks were engines, and Beria was the man who would feed them the fuel of human bodies. The technocrat of terror had finished his rehearsals. The real performance was about to begin. Dawn broke over the western frontier on June 22, 1941. But the sky wasn't just holding the morning light. It carried the smoke and fire of a catastrophe. Operation Barbarossa had begun. 3 million German soldiers poured across the border. They were the most sophisticated killing machine in human history. The Red Army, decapitated by the very purges Beria had helped finalize, collapsed in hours. Entire armies evaporated. Airfields turned into craters before pilots could even zip their flight suits. Communication lines to Moscow went dead. In the Kremlin, the silence was more terrifying than the bombs. Joseph Stalin, the man of steel, had retreated to his dacha. Paralyzed by disbelief, he left the empire headless. Meanwhile, Wehrmacht tanks chewed up the steppe. Into this vacuum stepped the State Defense Committee. Sitting at the right hand of power was Lavrentiy Beria. While generals looked at maps of the front lines in despair, Beria looked at maps of the interior. He calculated cold predatory math. He understood a fundamental truth. Industrial capacity, more than courage, would determine the war's outcome. And Soviet industry was currently sitting directly in the path of the German blitzkrieg. What followed was the greatest logistical miracle of the 20th century. It was a feat that would define Beria's legacy as the manager of hell. He was charged with the evacuation of Soviet industry. This was a task of biblical proportions that required dismantling entire cities and moving them thousands of miles east. In the span of a few months, over 1,500 major factories were taken apart, bolt by bolt, loaded onto flatbed rail cars, and moved behind the safety of the Ural Mountains. This was not a smooth operation of cranes and clipboards. It was a frantic, brutal tearing up of the earth. Beria unleashed the NKVD on the railways with draconian orders. Any delay in the train schedules was treated as sabotage, and station masters, who could not clear the tracks for the factory trains, were shot on the spot, their bodies left on the platforms as a grim warning to the next shift. When the trains arrived in the frozen wastes of Siberia and Kazakhstan, there were no buildings waiting for them, only snow, forest, and wolves. It was here that Beria's economic empire, the Gulag, proved its grim worth. Hundreds of thousands of Czechs were marched out into the blizzard, expendable fuel for the evacuation. They dug foundations in ground frozen as hard as iron. They laid tracks with frostbitten fingers that turned black and fell off, and they died of typhus, starvation, and exhaustion, dropping dead into the concrete. They were pouring. But the factories rose. Within weeks of arriving, the machines were humming again, often without roofs over them, snow falling on the lathes, producing the T-34 tanks that would eventually roll into Berlin. The Soviet war machine was saved, but it was built on a foundation of bones, presided over by the cold, bespectacled eyes of Beria. But Beria's war was not just against the Germans. It was a war against the internal enemy. and as the Germans advanced, he issued a secret directive regarding the prisoners in the Western territories. There was no time to evacuate the prisons in Ukraine and Belarus, and there were no trains to spare for enemies of the people. The solution was a massacre of industrial efficiency. In Lviv, in Minsk, in Kiev, as the NKVD prepared to retreat, they went cell to cell with grenades and machine guns. They threw explosives into crowded basements and set up firing squads in corridors, liquidating thousands of political prisoners, students, priests, nationalists, in days to prevent them from being liberated by the Germans. When the Wehrmacht arrived, they found prisons ankle deep in blood, a propaganda gift that would fuel the savagery of the Eastern Front for years. Beria also turned his gaze to the Red Army itself, implementing the ruthless blocking detachments. These were NKVD units stationed directly behind the regular army lines with orders that were simple and absolute. Machine gun any Soviet soldier who retreated without orders. Panic was punishable by death. In the meat grinder of Stalingrad, it was Beria's men who ensured that the only choice for a Russian soldier was to die facing the Germans or die facing their own countrymen. Yet, the darkest chapter of Beria's war took place far from the front lines in the mountains of the Caucasus, a crime so vast and so meticulously planned that it serves as the ultimate testament to his administrative genius and his moral emptiness. By 1943, Stalin had become convinced that certain ethnic minorities were disloyal, suspecting the Chechens, the Ingush, the Crimean Tatars, and the Kalmyks of collaborating with the Nazis. He wanted them gone, not just arrested, but erased from the map. Beria personally took charge of the operation, treating it like a military campaign, but instead of stormtroopers kicking down doors, he used deception. In February 1944, over 100,000 NKVD troops arrived in Chechnya and Ingushetia, not as conquerors, but as guests. They claimed they were there for training exercises and to help repair roads and bridges. They were billeted in the homes of the villagers, and the Chechens, bound by their ancient code of hospitality, fed these soldiers, shared their limited food, and gave them the best beds. For weeks, the executioners lived with their victims, playing with their children, learning their names, and sharing bread. Then came Red Army Day, February 23, 1944. At dawn, the traps snapped shut. The guests turned their guns on their hosts, ordering every man, woman, and child to the village squares, where Beria had coordinated thousands of American-made Studebaker trucks to be waiting. The violence was absolute and terrifyingly efficient. In the mountain village of Kaibak, heavy snow made the roads impassable for the transport trucks, and the NKVD commander radioed for instructions. Beria's reply was cryptic but clear. Dispose of the cargo. The soldiers drove over 700 people, mostly the elderly, women, and children who couldn't walk, into a large horse stable, locked the doors, and set it on fire. Anyone who tried to break out was machine-gunned, the smoke of burning bodies drifting over the mountains as a secret atrocity that would not be spoken of for half a century. For the rest of the nation, the destination was the cattle cars. Nearly 500,000 people were packed into wagons designed for livestock, with no food, no water, and no heating. The journey to the steppes of Kazakhstan took weeks. Typhus raged, and the dead were not allowed to be buried. Soldiers simply opened the sliding doors and kicked the frozen corpses out onto the snow beside the tracks, leaving a trail of bodies for the wolves to follow. Beria reported the success of Operation Lentil to Stalin with the pride of a schoolboy, and was awarded a medal for his successful execution of a special government task. He had effectively wiped entire nations off the map, dissolving their autonomous republics and erasing their names from Soviet encyclopedias. It was ethnic cleansing on an industrial scale, executed with the stroke of a pen. While Beria was managing the deportation of nations, he was also managing a very different kind of prison, one that was strange, paradoxical, and uniquely Soviet. These were the Sharashkas. Beria understood that among the enemies of the people rotting in the Gulag there were geniuses, engineers, physicists, mathematicians, men whose brains were worth more than their ability to chop wood. To let them die of scurvy and Kolyma was a waste of state assets. So he created the Golden Cage. The Sharashka was a special research bureau within the prison system where the inmates were top-tier scientists who had been arrested on trumped-up charges of sabotage or espionage. They were brought back from the brink of death in the labor camps, shaved, deloused, and put into clean rooms with drafting tables. The food was good: butter, white bread, meat, luxuries that ordinary Soviet citizens couldn't dream of during the war. But the windows had iron bars, the guards stood at the doors, and the threat was constant: produce or go back to the mines. Inside strictly guarded facility TSKB-29 in Moscow, the father of Russian aviation, Andrei Tupolev, sat drawing blueprints. He had been arrested in 1937, and now he was designing the Tu-2 dive bomber, the plane that would help crush the Luftwaffe. Working alongside him was a man whose jaw was broken, whose teeth had fallen out from scurvy, and whose neck bore the scars of the Kolyma gold mines. His name was Sergei Korolev. Years later, he would be the man to put the first human into space, but in 1942, he was just prisoner number 1442. The psychological atmosphere in the Sharashka was suffocating. These men were patriots who wanted to save their country from the Nazis, but they were forced to do it by the very regime that had destroyed their lives. Beria would visit occasionally, strolling through the design bureaus in his gleaming uniform, peering over the shoulders of men who were smarter than he would ever be. He played with them like toys, promising them freedom, review of their cases, or news of their families. Families who, unbeknownst to the scientists, might already be dead or in camps themselves. "Make the plane 10% faster," Beria would say, his voice devoid of technical understanding but heavy with menace. "And maybe we will see about your wife." It was a Faustian bargain. The scientists worked 18 hours a day, fueled by coffee and fear, pouring their genius into weapons of war, knowing that their success strengthened the very hand that held the key to their cage. They were slaves building the chariot for their emperor. One incident perfectly captures Beria's mindset. When a new fighter prototype crashed during a test flight, killing the pilot, Beria summoned the lead designer. He didn't ask about the hydraulics or the aerodynamics. He simply asked, "Which camp shall we send you to? Or should we just shoot you in the courtyard?" The designer was spared only because Stalin intervened, needing the plane more than the corpse. As 1945 approached, the Red Army was pushing into Germany. The war was ending. The factories in the Urals were churning out thousands of tanks. The Sharashkas had produced world-class aircraft, and the deportations were complete. Beria stood at the pinnacle of his power, having proven to Stalin that he could move mountains, erase nations, and enslave geniuses. But the end of World War II brought a new existential terror, for the Americans had revealed their own secret in the deserts of New Mexico, and the atomic bomb would change everything. Stalin saw the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima not just as an act of war against Japan, but as blackmail against the Soviet Union. He needed a bomb fast, and he knew there was only one man in the entire empire ruthless enough to build it from scratch in a country devastated by war. He called for Beria. The mandate changed. Beria was no longer just the policeman, the jailer, or the ethnic cleanser. He was now the atomic czar. The project would require more slave labor, more uranium, and more secrecy than anything that had come before. But as the victory parades marched through Red Square in June 1945 and captured Nazi banners were thrown into the mud at the foot of Lenin's mausoleum, a subtle shift was occurring. Beria watched from the plinth, his face impassive. He knew that in peace generals become dangerous to dictators, but executioners are always needed, or so he thought. He did not see that the very efficiency he had cultivated, the vast, autonomous state of the NKVD, was beginning to make the old man in the Kremlin nervous. The tool was becoming sharper than the hand that wielded it. The war was over, but the long, cold twilight of the gods was just beginning. The mushroom cloud that rose over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, did not merely end a war. It shattered the Soviet illusion of security. For Joseph Stalin, the atomic bomb was not a military weapon, but a diplomatic insult, a gun held to his temple by the Americans. The balance of power had shifted overnight, and the Soviet Union, despite its oceans of blood spilled from Stalingrad to Berlin, was suddenly vulnerable. In the frantic weeks that followed, Stalin summoned the only man capable of achieving the impossible, the man who had moved industries and erased nations. He summoned Lavrentiy Beria and gave him a directive that was as simple as it was terrifying. Build me a bomb. Do it quickly. If you fail, you will be shot. The project was given the innocuous code name Borodino, but to the thousands who would die for it, it was simply another circle of hell. Beria was appointed chairman of the Special Committee on the Atomic Bomb, a position that effectively made him the second most powerful man in the empire, granting him authority that superseded the military, the party, and the law itself. He approached nuclear physics not as a science, but as an intelligence operation and a construction project. He did not trust his own scientists, men like Igor Kurchatov and Yuli Khariton, whom he viewed as effete intellectuals prone to sabotage. Instead, he trusted the spies. Beria's genius, if it can be called that, lay in his realization that the quickest way to a bomb was theft. Through his vast network of NKVD agents embedded in the West, including the infamous Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs, Beria obtained the blueprints of the American Fat Man bomb before the smoke had even cleared over Nagasaki. When Kurchatov presented his calculations for a Soviet design, Beria would cross-reference them with the stolen American documents in his safe. If the numbers didn't match, he would look at the terrified scientist and ask softly, "Are you trying to mislead the party?" The scientists were working with a pistol to their heads, knowing that a miscalculation would be interpreted as treason. But blueprints were useless without the raw material of apocalypse: uranium. The Soviet Union had no established uranium mines, so Beria turned once again to his inexhaustible resource, the Gulag. He dispatched geological expeditions to the wildest corners of the empire, and when they found ore in the mountains of Central Asia and the frozen hell of Kolyma, he sent the prisoners. The mining operations at Butu-Gichag and Taboshar were death camps in the truest sense. There were no Geiger counters for the Zeks, no lead aprons, no ventilation shafts. Tens of thousands of men were sent into the mines to dig radioactive rock with pickaxes and bare hands. They inhaled the dust, drank the contaminated water, and slept on the ore. Their hair fell out, Their gums bled, and they wasted away from radiation sickness within months. To Beria, they were human radiation detectors. If a workforce died too quickly, it meant the ore was high quality. He replaced them with fresh trains of enemies of the people, burning through human lives to refine the plutonium necessary for the core. It was a pyramid of skulls, and at the top sat the bomb. By August 1949, the device was ready. The first test, codenamed RDS-1, was scheduled for 7 a.m. on August 29, 1949, at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The atmosphere in the bunker was suffocating. Beria was present, watching Kurchatov and the other physicists with the eyes of a hawk. He was suspicious to the very end, unconvinced by the science, believing that the scientists might be tricking him. He had already prepared 2 lists of names in his pocket. If the bomb detonated successfully, the first list would be used to award Hero of Socialist Labor medals. If it failed, the second list would be used to execute every scientist in the room for sabotage. As the countdown reached 0, the horizon was ripped apart by a blinding flash, followed by the roar of a new sun being born on the steppe. The shock wave rattled the bunker, and for the first time in his life, Beria was visibly shaken. When the mushroom cloud began to rise, proving that the Soviet Union was now a nuclear superpower, Beria embraced Kurchatov. He kissed him on the forehead. It was a kiss of Judas, a reminder of how close they had all come to the wall. "It would have been a great pity," Beria whispered to the trembling physicist, "to have had to shoot you." But while Beria was mastering the atom, becoming the Soviet Prometheus who stole fire from the Americans, he was descending into a personal darkness so profound that it remains the most reviled aspect of his legacy. Power is a potent aphrodisiac, and for a man with absolute power and no moral compass, the entire city of Moscow became a hunting ground. This was the era of the predator. If the Gulag was his business, sexual depravity was his hobby, pursued with the same bureaucratic efficiency and ruthlessness. By the late 1940s, the sight of his black Packard limousine, a luxurious American car with curtained windows, cruising the streets of Moscow at night, was enough to send a chill through the spine of any citizen. Beria did not prowl alone. He had a dedicated team of procurers, led by his chief bodyguard, Colonel Sarkisov and Colonel Nadaraya. These men were the grim reapers of innocence, tasked with spotting attractive women on the street, at the theater, or even at sports parades. The method was always the same, a ritualized abduction that played out hundreds of times. The Packard would slow down alongside a woman walking on Sadovaya Ring or Tverskaya Street. Sarkisov would jump out, flashing his NKVD badge, and politely but firmly invite the woman to take a ride. Sometimes he would say, "Comrade Beria has a task for you." Sometimes he would simply say, "The car's waiting." To refuse a direct invitation from the second most powerful man in the USSR was unthinkable. It was seen as an act of political defiance that could destroy not just the woman, but her entire family. Husbands who tried to intervene were beaten or arrested. Fathers who complained disappeared. The women were driven to the sprawling mansion at 28 Malaya Nikitskaya Street, a beautiful 19th century architectural gem that housed a dungeon of horrors. There, a table would be set with Georgian wines, cognac, and delicacies, a grotesque parody of a romantic dinner. Beria would appear charming at first, playing the role of the gallant host, toasting to their health, but the charm was a thin veneer over a bottomless pit of sadism. What happened in those soundproofed rooms was a systematic destruction of human dignity. Beria was not just a rapist. He was a predator who thrived on the power dynamic. He targeted everyone: famous actresses, ballerinas from the Bolshoi, wives of military generals, and most horrifyingly, teenage schoolgirls. The actress Tatiana Okunevskaya, a star of Soviet cinema, was one such victim. Invited under the pretense of performing for the Politburo, she was taken to his dacha, drugged, and raped. When she resisted, he simply smiled and reminded her that he could erase her existence. She was later arrested and sent to the Gulag for 10 years, a common fate for those who did not show enough gratitude. But the most chilling detail of the Beria legend, the one that cements his status as a psychological monster, was the aftermath. After he had finished with a victim, he would often present her with a bouquet of flowers. It was a ritual of twisting the knife. The flowers were a symbol of her silence, a token of a transaction she had never agreed to. If she accepted the flowers, she was allowed to go home, carrying the heavy burden of trauma and the knowledge that she was now compromised. If she threw the flowers back at him, or if she screamed, she was doomed. Colonel Sarkisov kept a meticulous list, a logbook of the women brought to the mansion. It contained names, addresses, and physical descriptions. Years later, after his fall, investigators would find piles of women's undergarments in his safe, kept as trophies alongside top-secret atomic documents. It was a collection of a serial killer operating with the resources of a state. The duality of Beria's life during these years is mind-bending. By day, he was the hyper-efficient administrator, shouting at generals, managing the logistics of a superpower, and terrified of Stalin's frown. He was a loving father to his son Sergo, a doting husband to his wife Nina, who willfully blinded herself to the horrors happening in the other wing of their house. But by night, he was a beast. There were rumors, dark and persistent, that not all women left the mansion alive. During the excavation of the mansion's garden in the 1990s, human bones were found. While forensic analysis was inconclusive about their identity or era, the legend persists that Beria used an industrial rock crusher in the basement to dispose of those who threatened to speak. Whether or not he literally ground them to dust, he certainly ground their souls. The terror he inflicted was so absolute that it created a cone of silence around him. Even Stalin, who knew everything, turned a blind eye. Stalin would jokingly warn his daughter, Svetlana, "Don't go driving with Beria alone." He indulged Beria's weakness because Beria was useful. As long as the atomic bombs were being built, as long as the dissent was being crushed, Stalin didn't care about the women of Moscow. But as the 1940s bled into the 1950s, a change was coming. The atomic project was a success, and the immediate external threat to the Soviet Union had receded. Stalin, now entering his 70s, was becoming increasingly frail and increasingly paranoid. He began to look at his Himmler, not with gratitude, but with suspicion. He saw a man who controlled the police, the bomb, and the secrets. He saw a rival. Beria, with his animal instinct for danger, felt the temperature dropping in the Kremlin. He knew the history of the men who sat in his chair before him, Yagoda and Yezhov. They had done the dirty work, and then they had been shot. He knew that the Mingrelian affair of 1951, a purge of his allies in Georgia, was the first tightening of the noose. The predator was about to become the prey. The atomic monster had built the ultimate weapon for the state, but he had no weapon against the paranoia of one old man. As the winter of 1952 approached, the shadows in the hallways of power grew longer, and Lavrentiy Beria began to sleep with a pistol under his pillow, knowing that the ghosts of the uranium mines and the women of Malaya Nikitskaya were waiting for him in the dark. The stage was set for the final act of the tragedy, a Game of Thrones played with real blood, where the prize was survival and the penalty was erasure. By the early 1950s, the Soviet Union was a superpower encased in ice, a monolithic empire stretching from Berlin to the Pacific, held together by the gravity of one man. But inside the high walls of the Kremlin, and deeper still within the wooded seclusion of the Consolidating, the atmosphere was not one of triumph, but of suffocating decay. Joseph Stalin was dying. He was 70 years old, his arteries hardening, his mind ravaged by a lifetime of hypervigilance and betrayal. The man of steel had become a fragile, terrifying old man who saw assassins in the shadows of his own bedroom, who tested his food on guards before eating, and who trusted no one, least of all the man who knew where all the bodies were buried. For Lavrentiy Beria, the post-war years were not a victory lap. They were a slow-motion walk to the gallows. He understood the rhythm of Stalin's purges better than anyone because he had orchestrated them. He knew that Stalin operated like a gardener who prunes the tallest poppies. Beria, with his atomic bomb success and his vast police empire, had grown too tall. The intimacy they shared as fellow Georgians, once his greatest shield, had become his greatest liability. Stalin began to look at Beria and see a reflection of his own dark past, a reminder of blood debts that could never be paid. The first blow fell in late 1951, and it was a masterpiece of indirect warfare. Stalin launched the Mingrelian affair. On the surface, it was an investigation into corruption and nationalist tendencies within the Communist Party of Georgia. In reality, it was a dagger aimed straight at Beria's heart. Beria was a Mingrelian, a distinct ethnic subgroup of Georgians, and his power base was built on the loyalty of his countrymen, whom he had placed in key positions throughout the Soviet apparatus. Stalin accused these men of conspiring with Western intelligence agencies to detach Georgia from the USSR. It was an absurd fabrication, but in Stalin's world, truth was irrelevant. Thousands of Beria's protégés were arrested, tortured, and executed. Beria watched helplessly as his network was dismantled brick by brick. He knew that the accusations against the Mingrelian nationalists were merely a prologue to an accusation against the big Mingrelian in Moscow. Stalin was isolating him, stripping away his armor before delivering the fatal strike. At Politburo dinners, the dictator would mock Beria, calling him our Himmler, with a sneer that no longer held any affection. He would ask pointedly, "Why are there so many Jews in your ministry, Lavrentiy?" The anti-Semitic undertone was a warning. The next purge would be ethnic, and Beria would be painted as the protector of Zionist spies. Then came the winter of 1952, a season of dread that froze the soul of the entire political elite. Stalin fabricated the doctor's plot. The narrative was medieval in its hysteria. A group of prominent Kremlin doctors, most of them Jewish, were accused of being killers in white coats, agents of American and British intelligence tasked with poisoning the Soviet leadership. This was not just an attack on the medical profession. It was a pretext for a decapitation strike against the old guard. If the doctors were spies, then the security services who had failed to catch them were incompetent or complicit. Beria, who had overseen state security for over a decade, was the obvious target. The MGB, now separated from Beria's direct control and run by the sycophantic Semyon Ignatiev, began arresting the doctors. They were beaten with rubber truncheons and kept in chains. Stalin personally directed the interrogation, screaming at Ignatiev, beat them until they confess." He wanted them to implicate Molotov, Mikoyan, and ultimately Beria. The torture chambers of the Lubyanka, which Beria had once managed with such cold efficiency, were now manufacturing the evidence for his own demise. Every morning, Beria would drive to the Kremlin past the gray facade of the prison, knowing that his own cell was being prepared. The tension inside the inner circle was unbearable. Stalin's dinners at Kuntsevo, once boisterous affairs of drinking and planning, became grim endurance tests. The quartet, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin, would be summoned late at night. They would watch movies they had seen a dozen times, forcing themselves to laugh at Stalin's jokes, terrified that a lack of enthusiasm would be interpreted as treason. They were wolves held at bay by an aging tiger, waiting for the beast to falter but terrified of its claws. Stalin played them against each other, whispering poison in their ears, testing their loyalty. He openly criticized Molotov and Mikoyan, casting them out of the inner circle. Beria knew he was running out of time. He began to sleep in different locations. He increased his personal security detail. He was a man walking on a frozen lake, listening to the ice crack with every step. Then came the night of February 28th, 1953. It was a Saturday. Stalin summoned the quartet to Kuntsevo for dinner and a movie. They ate, they drank the light Georgian wine Stalin favored, and they listened to the old man ramble about the past. By 4 a.m. on Sunday morning, March 1st, the gathering broke up. Stalin was in high spirits, reportedly jovial, showing no signs of illness. He walked his guests to the door, joking with Khrushchev. Beria looked into the dictator's eyes and saw no mercy, only the glint of a man who was preparing to clear the board. As the heavy limousines crunched down the gravel driveway and disappeared into the snowy Moscow night, Stalin told his guards, "I am going to sleep. Do not disturb me." It was an order that would seal his fate. March 1st dawned, a quiet Sunday. The guards at Kuntsevo waited for the movement signal. The sound of Stalin waking up, usually around noon. Noon came and went. Silence. 2 p.m. Silence. 6 p.m. The lights in Stalin's rooms clicked on, but there was no sound of footsteps, no call for tea. The guards, paralyzed by the absolute order, "Do not disturb," were terrified to enter. To disobey Stalin was death. To ignore a potential emergency was also death. They stood in the guardhouse, sweating, debating who should be the one to open the door. Finally, at 10 p.m., a courier arrived with mail from the Central Committee. Using this as a pretext, the deputy commandant, Peter Lozgachev, summoned the courage to enter the private quarters. He walked through the silent dining room and found a scene that would change history. The most powerful man on earth was lying on the Persian rug, wearing his pajama bottoms and an undershirt. He was soaked in cold urine. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage hours earlier and had been lying there, helpless, unable to speak, slowly dying on the floor of his own fortress. He lifted his hand weakly as Lozgachev entered, making a buzzing sound, zzz, but no words came out. His eyes were wide with terror and helplessness. The guards did not call a doctor. They were forbidden to do so without orders from the leadership. Instead, they called the Kremlin. They called Beria, and here the clock stopped. What followed was a deliberate, calculated act of passive assassination. Beria did not rush to the dacha with an ambulance. He waited. It took hours for the leadership to arrive. When Beria finally entered the room in the early hours of March 2nd, smelling the stench of urine and seeing the paralyzed tyrant, his reaction was not concern. It was triumph. He turned to the frightened guards and hissed, "Why are you creating panic? Can't you see Comrade Stalin is sleeping soundly after a night of hard work? Do not disturb him." He ordered everyone out. He forbade them from calling medical assistance. For 12 critical hours, while the hemorrhage expanded in Stalin's brain, destroying the centers of speech and movement, Beria stood guard over the dying process, ensuring that nature finished what the plots had failed to do. He knew that if Stalin woke up, even partially, the first order he would give would be for Beria's arrest. Stalin had to die. Only later, when the situation became undeniable, were doctors summoned. But these were not the best doctors. The best doctors were currently rotting in the Lefortovo prison, accused of being poisoners. The physicians who arrived were trembling so violently they could barely hold a stethoscope. They had to cut Stalin's shirt off because they were too afraid to move his body. They applied leeches to his neck, a medieval remedy for a modern dictator, attempting to lower his blood pressure. They injected camphor and caffeine. But it was theater. The man on the bed was already a corpse breathing. The death watch lasted for 4 agonizing days. The dacha was crowded with party officials, hovering like vultures. The smell of death mixed with the smell of stale tobacco. And in this claustrophobic room, Lavrentiy Beria performed a grotesque dance of duality that revealed the depths of his twisted soul. Witnesses, including Stalin's daughter Svetlana, watched in horror. When Stalin seemed to be unconscious, Beria would stride around the room, spewing hatred at the dying man. He would curse him, laugh at his helplessness, and even spit on the floor near the bed. He was the slave breaking his chains, reveling in the downfall of his master. But the moment Stalin's eyelids fluttered, a mere reflex of a dying brain, Beria would drop to his knees instantly. He would grab Stalin's limp hand and kiss it, covering it with tears, whispering, "My dear Joseph Vissarionovich, live, we need you." It was a performance of such transparent hypocrisy that it sickened everyone present. It was the behavior of a man who had no core, only survival instincts. On the evening of March 5th, the end came. Stalin's breathing changed. It became the terrifying Cheney-Stokes respiration, long pauses followed by gasping, rattling breaths. His face turned dark, almost black as he suffocated. Suddenly, in the final moment, he opened his eyes. Svetlana described the look as terrible, mad, perhaps angry, and full of the fear of death. He scanned the room, looking at the men he had terrorized for 30 years. He lifted his left hand, pointing upwards, perhaps a curse, perhaps a final command, and then collapsed. The struggle was over. The king was dead. Before the body was even cold, before the doctors could pull the sheet over Stalin's face, Beria was already moving. He didn't wait for prayers or tears. He pushed past the weeping Svetlana and the stunned Khrushchev. He ran out of the room, shouting for his driver, "Krustalev, the car!" His voice boomed with the energy of a man who had just inherited the earth. He raced back to the Kremlin to seize the files, to lock down the city, to claim the throne. He thought he was driving toward absolute power. He did not know that he was driving toward his own execution. The death of the god had not liberated him. It had simply started the countdown on a new, even deadlier clock. The era of the single tyrant was over. The era of the collective wolf pack had begun, and the wolves were hungry. On March 9th, 1953, under a gray slate sky that seemed to press down on the spires of the Kremlin, Red Square was a sea of black coats and red banners. It was the funeral of Joseph Stalin. The embalmed body of the dictator lay in the Hall of Columns, surrounded by mountains of flowers, while outside, the crush of the mourning crowd was so intense that hundreds of people were being trampled to death in the alleyways of Moscow, a final grim blood sacrifice to the man of steel. Standing atop Lenin's mausoleum, looking down at the weeping masses, stood the new masters of the Soviet Union. Georgy Malenkov, the designated premier, looked pale and doughy, a man clearly uncomfortable in the spotlight. Vyacheslav Molotov, the stone-faced diplomat, wept openly. Nikita Khrushchev, the country bumpkin in the ill-fitting suit, shuffled nervously. But one man stood out, Lavrentiy Beria. While others wept or feigned mourning, Beria appeared electrified. Wearing a fedora and a long trench coat, he moved with the restless energy of a predator who has just realized the cage door is open. In his eulogy, he spoke of guaranteeing the rights and liberties of Soviet citizens, a phrase that sounded bizarre coming from the lips of the supreme hangman. But Beria was not speaking to the crowd, he was speaking to history. He had already begun the most audacious, dangerous, and paradoxical high-wire act in the history of the Soviet Union. For the next 100 days, from March to June 1953, the monster of the Lubyanka would transform himself into the most radical liberal reformer the communist world had ever seen. It was a metamorphosis that stunned the world, terrified his colleagues, and ultimately signed his death warrant. Beria's first move was a lightning strike of administrative consolidation. Within 24 hours of Stalin's death, he had merged the Ministry of Internal Affairs, MVD, and the Ministry of State Security, MGB, back into a single, colossal superministry under his direct command. He replaced the leadership of the security services in every republic with his own loyalists. He brought the Dzerzhinsky Division, an elite motorized infantry unit loyal only to the secret police, into Moscow to guard the government buildings. To the other members of the Presidium, this looked like the prelude to a coup. They saw a man gathering the spears, but Beria, in his supreme arrogance, believed he didn't need a coup. He believed he was the only competent man in a room full of ideologues. He believed he could fix the broken machine of the Soviet state through sheer force of will. He started with the Gulag. Beria, the man who had enslaved millions, was the first to realize that slave labor was economically inefficient. The camps were costing more to guard and maintain than the value of the coal and timber they produced. The Gulag economy was bankrupting the state. On March 27th, less than 3 weeks after Stalin's death, Beria issued a decree that sent shock waves through the system, a mass amnesty. He ordered the release of over 1 million prisoners. These were not the politicals, the Trotskyites and enemies of the people whom he still considered dangerous, but the little people, women with children, the elderly, those serving short sentences for petty theft or unauthorized absence from work. The gates of the camp swung open. Trains packed with haggard, bewildered Czechs began to roll west from Siberia. It was a humanitarian gesture born of cold accounting, but the consequences were chaotic. The cold summer of 1953 saw a spike in crime as thousands of hardened criminals, released alongside the innocents, flooded the cities. Yet for millions of families, Beria was suddenly a hero, the liberator who had ended the nightmare. Then came the bombshell of April 4th. The front page of Pravda carried an announcement that was unthinkable just a month prior. The Ministry of Internal Affairs officially declared that the doctors' plot, the very conspiracy Stalin had used to terrorize the elite, was a complete fabrication. The announcement stated bluntly that the confessions of the doctors had been obtained through impermissible methods of investigation, a euphemism for torture. The doctors were released. The MGB officers who had tortured them were arrested. This was not just a correction of a judicial error. It was a delegitimization of the entire Stalinist system. Beria was effectively telling the Soviet people, the party lied to you, the leader was wrong. He then issued a secret order prohibiting the use of torture in all future interrogations, dismantling the torture chambers he himself had helped build. He closed the prestigious investigation unit for special cases. He even began to speak about the need for the rule of law. It was a dizzying, hypocritical spectacle. The butcher was washing the blood off his hands in public, presenting himself as the champion of justice. But his colleagues, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Molotov, and Bulganin, were not fooled. They were terrified. They realized that by exposing the crimes of the Stalin era, Beria was threatening their own survival. They were all complicit. They had all signed the death lists. If Beria continued to pull the thread, the entire tapestry of the Soviet regime would unravel, and they would all be hanged. Khrushchev, in particular, watched with growing alarm. He saw that Beria was using these reforms to build a popular base of support outside the party, positioning himself as a populist leader who could bypass the Central Committee. But Beria's domestic reforms were merely the opening salvo. It was in foreign policy that he committed his fatal overreach. He looked at the Cold War map and saw a series of expensive, useless conflicts that were draining the Soviet treasury. He was a pragmatist, not a zealot. He didn't care about the spread of global communism. He cared about the stability of the USSR. First, Korea. The war had been dragging on for 3 years, a stalemate of blood and mud. Stalin had kept it going to bleed the Americans. Beria stopped it. He sent telegrams to the Chinese and North Korean leadership that were essentially orders. End the war. Take the armistice. We are cutting off the supplies. He forced Kim Il-sung to the negotiating table. The guns fell silent, and the West breathed a sigh of relief. But in the Kremlin, this was seen as a capitulation to American imperialism. Then came the issue of the non-Russian republics. Beria, a Georgian, had always harbored a resentment against the Russification policies of the central government. He issued secret circulars ordering that the leadership of the republics, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, should be native to those regions, not Russians sent from Moscow. He ordered that official business be conducted in local languages. He was trying to defuse the ticking bomb of ethnic nationalism. But to the Russian-dominated leadership in Moscow, this looked like the dismantling of the empire. They whispered that Beria was a bourgeois nationalist in disguise, a man who wanted to break the Soviet Union into a confederation of states. The final straw, the act that would unite his enemies against him in a pact of blood, was East Germany. By June 1953, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, was on the verge of collapse. The hardline Stalinist leader, Walter Ulbricht, was imposing socialism with a sledgehammer, demanding higher production quotas and collectivization. People were fleeing to the West by the thousands. The Soviet ambassador warned that an uprising was imminent. Beria proposed a solution that was so radical it stunned the Presidium into silence. He circulated a top-secret memorandum suggesting that a socialist East Germany was not necessary. He proposed abandoning the GDR. He argued that a neutral, unified, bourgeois, democratic Germany, disarmed and paying reparations to the USSR, would be better for Soviet security than a hostile, unstable satellite state that required constant subsidies. A peaceful Germany, he argued, was preferable to a socialist one. He was willing to sell out the German communists to buy peace with the West and secure American financial aid. Molotov, the old Bolshevik, was apoplectic. To give up territory won with the blood of 20 million Soviet soldiers? To hand East Germany back to the capitalists? It was heresy. It was treason. Khrushchev saw his opening. He realized that Beria had gone too far. He had alienated the military, the ideologues, and the party apparatus. He was alone. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. Just as the Presidium was debating Beria's German proposal, the streets of Berlin exploded. On June 16, 1953, construction workers in East Berlin downed tools. The strike turned into a massive anti-government uprising. Crowds marched on government buildings, burning Soviet flags, demanding free elections. It was the first major revolt against Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. For Beria, this was a catastrophe. His enemies pointed to the burning streets of Berlin and said, "See, this is what your liberalism leads to. Weakness invites counter-revolution." Beria was forced to send in the tanks to crush the very people he had wanted to liberate. Soviet T-34s rolled through Berlin, firing into the crowds. The uprising was suppressed, but Beria's political capital lay in ruins. With Beria's position weakened by the chaos in Berlin, his enemies finally saw their chance to strike. The time for whispering was over. The time for knives had begun. The summer of 1953 in Moscow was hot and stifling, the kind of oppressive heat that makes the air feel heavy with unsaid words. Inside the red brick walls of the Kremlin, the temperature was rising even faster. Lavrentiy Beria, the master of the secret police, the man whose ears were everywhere, believed he was unassailable. He walked the corridors of power with the swagger of a man who owned the future, his portfolio bulging with reforms that would reshape the Soviet empire. But while he was looking at the horizon, staring at maps of a unified Germany and a pacified Korea, he failed to see the knife being sharpened in the shadows directly behind him. He had made the classic mistake of the tyrant. He assumed that fear was the same thing as loyalty. He believed that the gray men of the Presidium, Malenkov, Khrushchev, Molotov, Bulganin, were sheep who would bleat and follow wherever the shepherd led. He did not realize that sheep, when cornered by a wolf, can find a desperate, collective courage. The plot to destroy Beria was not born of ideology. It was born of a primal biological imperative: kill or be killed. The architect of this conspiracy was the most unlikely figure in the Soviet leadership. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev was widely regarded as the court jester. With his ill-fitting suits, his peasant vocabulary, and his boisterous, sometimes buffoonish manner, he seemed harmless. Beria treated him with open condescension, often mocking him in meetings, interrupting him or treating him like a slow-witted younger brother. But beneath the moon-faced exterior lay a mind of razor-sharp cunning and a will of iron. Khrushchev understood the mechanics of the Soviet court better than anyone. He knew that plotting against the head of the MVD was akin to trying to disable a bomb while sitting on top of it. The Kremlin was wired. Every phone was tapped. Every office was bugged. Even the bathrooms were suspect. To speak a word of treason was to invite a bullet to the back of the neck. Thus began the whispering campaign. It was a conspiracy conducted in the open air, a slow, terrifying dance of seduction and terror. Khrushchev could not hold meetings. He could not send memos. He had to recruit the conspirators one by one, face to face, in places where Beria's microphones could not reach. He would invite Premier Malenkov for a walk in the gardens of the Vorobiovi Gori, speaking in hushed tones while the wind rustled the leaves. He would corner Molotov in the corridors of the Central Committee building, pulling him into a window alcove where the noise of the street traffic masked their voices. He even held conversations in the Kremlin restrooms, turning the taps on full blast to create a wall of sound before whispering the deadly proposition: Lavrentiy is preparing to liquidate us. If we don't strike first, we are dead men. The hardest target was Georgy Malenkov. He was the premier, the titular head of the state and technically Beria's closest ally. They had formed a duumvirate after Stalin's death. But Khrushchev played on Malenkov's vanity and his fear. "Do you see how he treats you?" Khrushchev whispered. "He interrupts you. He laughs at you. He's already acting like the Tsar. How long before he decides he doesn't need a premier?" Slowly, painstakingly, the alliance fractured. Malenkov, a man of weak character who always drifted toward the strongest gravitational pull, began to shift. He realized that Beria's radical reforms were isolating him from the party apparatus. He saw the anger of the generals. He saw the fear in the eyes of the apparatchiks. Khrushchev offered him a lifeline. "Join us, and you survive. Stay with him, and you go down with the monster." Malenkov flipped. But a political alliance was not enough. Beria had the guns. The MVD had its own army, the internal troops, divisions of fanatical soldiers, tanks, and aircraft that answered only to him. The regular police were his, the Kremlin Guard was his. If the Presidium voted to arrest him, Beria could simply snap his fingers, and a squad of blue caps would enter the room and arrest the Presidium. Khrushchev needed muscle. He needed the only force in the Soviet Union that could stand toe-to-toe with the secret police. He needed the Red Army. He reached out to Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the hero of World War II, the conqueror of Berlin. Zhukov was a living legend. He was also a man with a deep, burning hatred for the secret police. He had watched his friends, his colleagues, and his mentors dragged away and shot during the Great Terror. He had been sidelined and humiliated by Stalin and Beria after the war, banished to obscure commands in Odessa and the Urals to keep him from becoming a Napoleon. Now he was Deputy Minister of Defense. When Khrushchev approached him, Zhukov did not hesitate. The conversation was brief and brutal. "Can you arrest him?" Khrushchev asked. Zhukov's reply was the growl of a tiger let out of a cage. "I will arrest the bastard myself. Just give me the order." The date was set for June 26th, 1953. It was a Friday. A joint meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee and the Council of Ministers was scheduled. The official agenda was mundane: discussions on the harvest, the budget, and the ongoing crisis in East Germany. But the real agenda was a coup d'etat. The plan was a logistical nightmare. The Kremlin was a fortress guarded by Beria's men. Bringing in a military assault team was impossible. They would be stopped at the gates. They had to be smuggled in. On the morning of June 26th, the conspirators moved their pieces. Marshal Zhukov and a select group of high-ranking generals, Moskalenko, Batitsky, and others, arrived at the Kremlin in separate cars. They were not wearing their medals. They carried their service revolvers hidden under their tunics, a severe violation of Kremlin protocol, where weapons were strictly forbidden in the presence of the leadership. Khrushchev had personally authorized the breach. They were smuggled into the waiting room of Bulganin's office, right next to the meeting hall. They sat there for hours, smoking nervously, checking their watches, sweating in their heavy wool uniforms. They were the execution squad waiting for the signal. Meanwhile, outside Moscow, the unimaginable was happening. The Kantemirovskaya and Tamanskaya tank divisions, the elite armored fist of the Soviet army, began to roll towards the capital. The official explanation was summer training exercises. In reality, they were moving to secure the city center, block the MVD barracks, and prevent a counter-coup by Beria's loyalists. The rumble of tank treads on the asphalt sent a tremor through the city, but the citizens, accustomed to military movements, paid little heed. Lavrentiy Beria woke up that morning in his mansion on Malaya Nikitskaya. He was in high spirits. He had prepared a new memorandum on the nationality question in Ukraine, another radical reform that would further shake the foundations of Russian dominance. He kissed his wife Nina goodbye, or perhaps he didn't. Their relationship had long been a cold formality, and stepped into his armored Packard. As the limousine glided through the Borovitsky Gate and into the Kremlin, the guards saluted him. He was the master of this domain. He climbed the stairs to the meeting room, his briefcase swinging by his side, unaware that he was walking into a trap that had been bolted shut behind him. The meeting began at 1 p.m. The long oak table was set. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the summer sun. Malenkov sat at the head of the table, looking pale and sweating profusely. Beria sat to his right, confident, perhaps even bored. He opened his briefcase and began to arrange his papers. He adjusted his pince-nez. He looked around the table and noticed something odd. Khrushchev was staring at him with a strange intensity. Molotov refused to meet his eyes. There was a palpable tension in the air, a static charge that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "What is on the agenda today?" Beria asked, his voice cutting through the silence. "The German question?" Malenkov tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He choked. The premier of the Soviet Union, the man who had survived Stalin's purges, was paralyzed by fear. He looked at Khrushchev desperately. Khrushchev, realizing that the moment was slipping away, kicked Malenkov under the table. "Start," he hissed. Malenkov found his voice high and trembling. "The agenda? There is one item. The question of the anti-party, anti-state activities of LP Beria." The room froze. Beria jolted back in his chair as if he had been slapped, his face drained of color. He looked at Malenkov, then at Khrushchev, a look of genuine confusion and betrayal dawning in his eyes. "What is this, Nikita?" he stammered. "What are you doing? We are friends. What is going on?" Khrushchev stood up. The jester was gone. In his place was the prosecutor. He unleashed a tirade that had been bottling up for years. He accused Beria of being a British spy since 1919, an agent of the Musavatist counterintelligence in Baku. He accused him of sabotage in agriculture. He accused him of trying to place the MVD above the party. He accused him of moral degeneracy. It was a mixture of lies, half-truths, and the very real grievances of men who had lived in terror of him for too long. "You are not a communist," Khrushchev shouted, his face reddening. "You are a careerist, a traitor, a vampire sucking the blood of the party." Beria tried to interrupt. He looked around the table for allies. "Vyacheslav," he pleaded to Molotov, "surely you don't believe this nonsense?" Molotov, cold as ice, replied with a litany of his own grievances. "You tried to destroy the alliance with China. You wanted to sell out Germany." One by one, the other members of the Presidium chimed in. Kaganovich, Mikoyan, Voroshilov. It was a feeding frenzy. The pack had turned on the wolf. Beria, realizing the magnitude of the betrayal, reached for his briefcase. Perhaps he was reaching for a document to refute them. Perhaps he was reaching for a gun. Malenkov panicked. He pressed a secret button installed under the table, the signal for the military. The double doors at the end of the room crashed open. Marshal Zhukov rushed in, followed by General Moskalenko and the armed officers. They were breathless, their eyes wide with adrenaline. They had been waiting for the signal, terrified that the MVD guards outside might have discovered them. Zhukov marched straight up to Beria. The contrast was striking. The tall, broad-shouldered marshal in his uniform, the symbol of Soviet victory, towering over the stout, balding bureaucrat in his civilian suit, the symbol of Soviet terror. "Hands up," Zhukov roared. His voice echoed off the high ceilings. "You are under arrest." Beria looked at Zhukov. He looked at the gun in Moskalenko's hand. The arrogance vanished. The administrative genius who could move millions of people across a continent suddenly could not move his own legs. He sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. Zhukov grabbed him by the lapels and hauled him out of the chair. He patted him down roughly, searching for weapons. He found none. He took Beria's briefcase. He took his belt so he couldn't hang himself. He took his pince-nez glasses and crushed them in his hand or pocketed them. Accounts vary, but the stripping of his vision was the first step in his dehumanization. Without his glasses, Beria was squinting, helpless, reduced instantly from a monster to a pathetic, myopic man. "Take him away," Khrushchev ordered. But the danger was far from over. They had arrested Beria, but they were still trapped inside the Kremlin, surrounded by Beria's own Praetorian Guard. If the MVD guards outside the door realized that their chief had been taken, there would be a firefight in the corridors of power. The conspirators had to smuggle him out. They waited until nightfall. For hours, Beria was held in a secure room, guarded by the generals who kept their guns trained on him. He sat in a chair, weeping, begging, asking to see Malenkov, asking to see Khrushchev, promising to confess to anything if they would just spare his life. The generals looked at him with disgust. This was the man who had signed the death warrants of their comrades, this sobbing heap. Under the cover of darkness, a ZS 110 limousine was brought to the rear entrance. This was not Beria's car. It was Bulganin's or a military vehicle. They dragged Beria out. They didn't put him in the seat. They forced him to lie down on the floorboards in the back. Marshal Konev and General Moskalenko sat on the seat above him, their boots resting on the man who had once ruled the empire. They threw a rug over him to hide him from the guards at the gate. The car approached the Kremlin exit. The driver, sweating, slowed down. The MVD guard peered into the window. He saw the marshals of the Soviet Union. He saluted. He did not see the Soviet Himmler trembling under their feet. The barrier lifted. The car accelerated into the night, speeding towards the headquarters of the Moscow military district. The trap had sprung. The coup was successful. But for Lavrentiy Beria, the true horror was just beginning. He had been stripped of his power, his rank, and his dignity. Now, he was just a body in a bunker, waiting for the very justice he had denied to millions. The whispering campaign had ended in a scream of tires peeling away from the Kremlin, carrying the last monster of the Stalinist age into the darkness he had created. The ZIS 110 limousine sped through the darkened streets of Moscow, carrying a cargo that was technically already dead, though his heart was still beating. Lavrentiy Beria, the former marshal of the Soviet Union, lay huddled on the floorboards of the car, covered by a rough woolen rug, with the boots of his captors resting on his ribs. He was not taken to the Lubyanka, the cathedral of terror he had built and presided over for 15 years. The conspirators knew better. The Lubyanka was staffed by men who owed their careers and perhaps their lives to Beria. Instead, he was driven to the headquarters of the Moscow military district, a fortress of the Red Army, the one institution that had always hated him. There, deep underground in a reinforced concrete bunker designed to survive an atomic blast, the Soviet Himmler was thrown into a cell. It was a space of absolute sensory deprivation. The walls were bare. The light was a single naked bulb that burned 24 hours a day, stripping away the concept of time. He was stripped of his suit, his belt, and his tie, precautions against suicide, and left in a pair of ill-fitting prison fatigues. But the cruelest deprivation was the confiscation of his pince-nez. Without his glasses, Beria was almost blind. He was reduced to a squinting, fumbling figure, groping at the walls of his confinement, a physical manifestation of his sudden political impotence. For 6 months, from June to December 1953, Beria sat in this concrete box. The man who had managed the atomic project, who had moved millions of people across continents like chess pieces, was now reduced to a singular pathetic obsession: writing letters. He was allowed pen and paper, and he used them to pour out a torrent of desperation that remains one of the most psychologically revealing archives in Soviet history. He did not write like a statesman. He did not write like a revolutionary. He wrote like a spurned lover, a confused child, and a terrified animal all at once. He addressed his captors by their first names, unable to grasp that the intimacy of the past was gone forever. "Dear Nikita," he scrawled in a shaky hand to Khrushchev, "why are you doing this? We are friends. We are brothers. I saved you from Stalin's wrath. Do you remember?" To Malenkov he pleaded, "Georgie, for the love of God, intervene. I will do anything. I will dig ditches. I will work on a collective farm. I will manage a brick factory. Just let me live. I am useful. I can still serve the party." He bargained with the universe. He offered to reveal secrets about Western intelligence networks. He offered to detail the crimes of Stalin, conveniently forgetting that he was the instrument of those crimes. He blamed everything on the dead dictator. "I was just a tool," he wrote. "I was forced. I tried to soften the blows." These letters were carried upstairs to the Kremlin, where the Presidium gathered to read them. But they did not read them with pity. They read them with a mixture of revulsion and dark amusement. Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Molotov passed the pages around the table, laughing nervously at the abject humiliation of the man they had once feared. They saw in his pleading not a human being, but a monster unmasked. The fact that the Iron Bolshevik was crying for his life only confirmed their decision to kill him. To them, his cowardice was proof of his guilt. If he were a true communist, they reasoned, he would have accepted his fate with dignity. Instead, he was squealing. While Beria rotted in the bunker, the machinery of the state was rewriting his life. The newspapers, which had praised him as a hero of the Soviet Union just weeks before, now painted him as a bourgeois degenerate, a British spy, and a moral monster. In a move of Orwellian brilliance, the editors of the great Soviet encyclopedia were faced with a problem. The current volume, recently mailed to subscribers across the USSR, contained a long, glowing article about Beria Lavrentiy, accompanied by a full-page portrait. The state issued urgent instructions to all libraries and subscribers. They were sent a new page, carefully sized to fit exactly over the Beria entry. The new article was about the Bering Sea. Subscribers were instructed to use a razor blade to cut out Beria and paste in the ocean. Across the Soviet Union, in millions of homes and libraries, the man was physically excised from history, replaced by cold, dark water. The trial, if it can be called that, began on December 18, 1953. It was held in the headquarters of the Moscow military district, not in a courthouse. There was no jury. There were no defense attorneys. There was no right of appeal. It was a special judicial presence of the Supreme Court presided over by Marshal Ivan Konev, a man who hated Beria with the fiery intensity of a soldier who had seen his comrades purged by the NKVD. The other judges were also military men or party functionaries who had already signed the death warrant in their minds. Beria was brought into the room. He looked wretched. He had lost weight. His face was gray and unshaven. He squinted at his judges, trying to recognize the men he had once commanded. The charges read out against him were a bizarre mixture of the terrifyingly real and the absurdly fake. He was accused of the terrorization of the party and the murder of innocent Bolsheviks, charges that were undeniably true. But he was also accused of being a spy for British intelligence since 1919, of being an agent of the Musavati's counter-revolutionary government in Azerbaijan, and of attempting to restore capitalism in the USSR. Beria defended himself with a strange, jagged energy. He admitted to the moral depravity. He admitted to the rapes, though he framed them as excesses of a personal nature. He admitted to the purges of 1937, but claimed he was merely following Stalin's direct orders. "I was the hammer," he shouted, "but Stalin was the hand." But when it came to the charge of being a British spy, he exploded. "That is a lie," he screamed. "I am an old Bolshevik. I have given my life to the revolution. You can shoot me, but do not slander my revolutionary honor." It was a futile distinction. The court was not interested in the truth. It was interested in a verdict. The trial lasted 5 days. On December the 23rd, 1953, the sentence was delivered: death by shooting, confiscation of all property, stripping of all titles and awards. Beria listened to the verdict with his head bowed. When asked if he had any final words, he began to ramble, babbling about his contributions to the atomic bomb, about his love for the motherland, about his innocence. Marshal Konev cut him off. "Take him away." The execution was carried out immediately. There was no waiting for dawn. There was no last meal. The conspirators were still terrified that Beria's supporters might attempt a rescue. He was dragged down to a semi-basement room in the bunker, a space with bare concrete walls, and a floor that could be easily hosed down. The executioner was General Pavel Batitsky, who had volunteered for the job. He was accompanied by the prosecutor general, Rudenko, and a few other officers. They wanted to see the monster die with their own eyes. When Beria realized he was about to die, the last shred of his composure disintegrated. He fell to his knees in the filth of the floor. He began to weep, a high, keening sound that echoed off the concrete. He crawled toward Batitsky, clutching at his boots, blubbering, begging, promising anything. "Mercy, comrades, mercy." Batitsky looked down at the sobbing creature with utter contempt. This was the man who had sent millions to the wall without blinking, the man who had raped schoolgirls and then sent them to the Gulag. And now he couldn't even face a bullet like a man. The noise was unbearable. Batitsky turned to one of his aides. "Shut him up." A dirty piece of underwear, or perhaps a rag used for cleaning weapons, was found in a corner. It was jammed forcefully into Beria's mouth, stifling his screams into muffled, choking sobs. His hands were tied behind his back. He was hauled to his feet and shoved against the wall, but his legs gave way and he slumped back down. Batitsky didn't wait. He drew his service revolver, a standard-issue Tokarev TT-33. He aimed directly at the center of Beria's forehead, right between the eyes that had seen so much and understood so little. He pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the small room. The bullet tore through Beria's skull, exiting the back and splashing blood and brain matter onto the concrete. The body convulsed once, then slumped sideways, a heap of gray fatigues and dead flesh. The Soviet Himmler was gone. There was no funeral. The body was not buried. To bury him would be to create a shrine for neo-Stalinists. Instead, the corpse was wrapped in a canvas sheet and taken to the crematorium of the Donskoy monastery. Or, according to some darker accounts, it was burned right there in the bunker's incinerator, or even dissolved in acid. The most persistent and poetic legend is that his body was cremated, and his ashes were blown into the intake of a giant industrial ventilator fan, scattered into the dust of Moscow, ensuring that he would be inhaled by the very people he had terrorized. He became nothing. He became the dust in the air. Lavrentiy Beria's death marked the true end of the Stalinist era. The thaw that followed was messy and imperfect, but the great engine of industrial-scale terror was dismantled. The gulags were slowly emptied. The midnight knocks on the door became less frequent. The secret police were brought under the control of the party, leashed and muzzled, never again allowed to become a state within a state. But there was no justice, not really. The men who killed Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Molotov, were not heroes. They were accomplices. They had sat at the same tables, signed the same lists, and toasted the same purges. They killed Beria because he was dangerous to them, regardless of his morality. They made him the scapegoat for the sins of an entire generation. By painting him as the sole villain, the British spy who hoodwinked the party, they absolved themselves. They washed their hands in his blood and declared themselves clean. The injustice of the Soviet century is that there was never a Nuremberg trial for the Gulag. There was no reckoning. The system simply devoured its own executioner and moved on. Beria was the last dragon slain by the other dragons, so they could shapeshift into bureaucrats. Yet as the smoke clears from the bunker, a question remains. Beria was the architect, but he did not work alone. He could not break 10 million fingers by himself. He needed men to do the dirty work. Men who stood in the blood-spattered cellars of the Lubyanka. There were thousands of them. Anonymous men who went home to their families after a day of torture. But one man stood out. A man whose cruelty was so inventive that even the other executioners feared him. A man who didn't just follow orders, but savored them. Who was the man they called the brain breaker? Who was the interrogator that Beria himself relied on to crack the uncrackable? And what happened to him when the master fell? Join us in the next episode as we descend into the mind of the man who claimed, until his dying breath, that he was the real victim. Boris Rodos, the sadist who just followed orders.